is later cultivated in the Caribbean. Camera 2 side note, none of the primary crops grown by slaves, sugar, tobacco, coffee, is necessary to sustain human life. So in a way, slavery is a very early byproduct of a consumer culture that revolves around the purchase of goods that bring us pleasure, but not sustenance. You are welcome to draw your own metaphorically resonant conclusions from this fact. One of the big misconceptions about slavery, at least when I was growing up, was that Europeans somehow captured Africans, put them in chains, stuck them on boats, and then took them to the Americas. The chains and ships bit is true, as is the America part, if you define America as America and not as America. But Africans were living in all kinds of conglomerations, from small villages to city-states to empires, and they were much too powerful for the Europeans to just conquer. And in fact, Europeans obtained African slaves by trading for them. Because trade is a two-way proposition, this meant that Africans were captured by other Africans and then traded to Europeans in exchange for goods, usually like metal tools or fine textiles or guns. And for those Africans, slaves were a form of property, and a very valuable one. In many places, slaves were one of the only sources of private wealth because land was usually owned by the state. And this gets to a really important point. If we're going to understand the tragedy of slavery, we need to understand the economics of it. We need to get inside what Mark Twain famously called a deformed conscience. We have to see slaves both as they were, as human beings, and as they were viewed, as an economic commodity. Right, so you probably know about the horrendous conditions aboard slave ships, which at their largest could hold 400 people. But it's worth underscoring that each slave had an average of 4 square feet of space. That is 4 square feet. As one eyewitness testified before Parliament in 1791, they had not so much room as a man in his coffin. Once in the Americas, the surviving slaves were sold at a market very similar to the way cattle would be sold. After purchase, slave owners would often brand their new possession on the cheeks, again, just as they would do with cattle. The lives of slaves were dominated by work and terror, but mostly work. Slaves did all types of work, from housework to skilled crafts work, and some even worked as sailors, but the majority of them worked as agricultural laborers. In the Caribbean and Brazil, most of them planted, harvested, and processed sugar, working 10 months out of the year, dawn until dusk. The worst part of this job, which is saying something because there were many bad parts, was fertilizing the sugar cane. This required slaves to carry 80-pound baskets of manure on their heads up and down hilly terrain. Mr. Green, isn't there a poop joke in there somewhere? No, me from the past, because this whole thing is too depressing. When it came time to harvest and process the cane, speed was incredibly important because once cut, sugar sap can go sour within a day. This meant that slaves would often work 48 hours straight during harvest time, working without sleep in the sweltering sugar press houses where the cane would be crushed in hand rollers and then boiled. Slaves often caught their hands in the rollers, and their overseers kept a hatchet on hand for amputations. Ugh, I told you this wasn't going to be funny. Given these appalling conditions, it's little wonder that the average life expectancy for a Brazilian slave on a sugar plantation in the late 18th century was 23 years. Things were slightly better in British sugar colonies like Barbados, and in the US, living and working conditions were better still. So relatively good, that in fact slave populations began increasing naturally, meaning that more slaves were born than died. This may sound like a good thing, but it is of course its own kind of evil, because it meant that slave owners were calculating that if they kept their slaves healthy enough, they would reproduce, and then the slave owners could steal and sell their children, or use them to work their land. Either way, blah. Anyway, this explains why even though the percentage of slaves imported from Africa to the United States was relatively small, slaves and other people of African descent came to make up a significant portion of the US population. The brutality of working conditions in Brazil, on the other hand, meant that slaves were never able to increase their population naturally, hence the continued need to import slaves into Brazil until slavery ended in the 1880s.